This week on The Inside Story, a free press matters. The Israel-Hamas war becomes the most deadly conflict for media in history. Burmese journalists in exile reporting on Myanmar 3 years after a military coup. A Nigerian news outlet with a fresh look at the humanitarian costs of war. And reporters turned war crimes investigators get first-hand accounts of Russian atrocities in Ukraine. Now, on The Inside Story, journalism and conflicts.
Welcome to The Inside Story, a free press matters. I'm VOA Press Freedom Editor Jessica Dorit in our New York studios. This week, we're taking a close look at the dangers journalists face on the front lines of conflict and the lengths they go to cover vitally important stories. We begin with the Israel-Hamas war. Egyptian, Israeli and Qatari officials met in Cairo on Tuesday in an attempt to reach a deal to stop the fighting in Gaza. This after an Israeli raid resulted in the safe return of 2 hostages, but killed 67 Palestinians, some of them civilians in Rafah. And as the Israeli military prepares for what could be a major offensive in that southern city, around 1.4 million people have fled to Rafah to escape fighting in Gaza. UN Secretary General Antonio Guterres says he holds out hope an offensive there can be avoided.
My sincere hope is that the negotiations for the release of hostages and some form of cessation of hostilities to be successful, to avoid a all-out offensive over Rafah, where the core of the humanitarian system is located, and that would have devastating consequences.
Media covering the conflict must navigate restrictions on access and serious risks to personal safety. From Jerusalem, here's Celia Mendoza.
Covering the West Bank has always had its challenges for Palestinian and Israeli journalists. But since the October 7 Hamas terror attack and Israel's counteroffensive, conditions are increasingly dangerous.
It's dangerous for all the journalists, not only for Al Jazeera journalists. But it seems that we are paying the high price because we are very active and we're trying to cover everything inside the Gaza, even in the dangerous areas.
Some journalists say reporting on the military operations by either side has always been restricted.
In general, it's challenging to cover military operations in the West Bank. In general, even before October 7th. Especially for Palestinian journalists, but also for Israeli journalists. Israeli journalists can hardly go into areas that are controlled by the Palestinian Authority.
Reporting from the West Bank possesses a set of unique risks, including attacks by Israeli settlers and Israeli and Palestinian law enforcement.
I released the stickers that I am from my car because it is target for the Israeli army, and it is target for the settlers to attack any car for press.
Before the latest conflict, Bakr had been criticized for his activism and anti-Israel comments. The Israeli government denies targeting journalists. A Ministry of Foreign Affairs spokesperson told VOA via email that almost half of the journalists killed were actually terrorists. But the media watchdog, the Committee to Protect Journalists, has confirmed over 85 journalists killed in the first 4 months of the war, nearly all Palestinian. Free movement has also decreased in the region, with checkpoints and restrictions on access in the West Bank.
They targeting the Palestinian journalists, they will targeting also his family, and they will complicate the life for them.
Some Palestinian journalists are setting up emergency plans to help teams working under conflict conditions. For Israeli journalists, however, the focus is on the hostages Hamas still holds and the terror attack that left 1,200 dead. For Israeli media, says Saragusti, there is an expectation from audiences of patriotism in their coverage.
I can tell you that the audience really want the journalists to rally around the flag, and they don't want to see any criticism. They are not open and cannot contain any human stories coming from the other side. Now they cannot contain, too much details about the humanitarian crisis in Gaza. They don't care. They don't want to hear about it. They're still very much concentrated on the devastation after October 7th.
That coverage differs from the international media. With the IDF controlling who can enter Gaza, those journalists are requesting independent access to report on the war. Celia Mendoza, VOA News, Jerusalem.
A journalist's ability to witness conflict firsthand and speak with those directly affected is an essential part of the media's role as watchdog. In Ukraine, reporters are using their skills to document evidence of war crimes. Here's Anna Chernikova in Kyiv.
The Reckoning Project aims to be a game changer in the world of human rights and investigative journalism. Co-founded by Janine Di Giovanni, a human rights reporter and investigator in conflict zones, the project fights for justice and accountability in times of war, in the court of public opinion and the courts of law.
I've always worked in conflict zones, war zones, or the aftermath of war, and I've always taken testimonies of survivors. Someone has to keep a record of that. I think all wars and all places where people suffer should be treated equally.
The Reckoning Project combines advocacy and journalism, training reporters and researchers to record, collect, and conserve witness statements and testimonies so that they can be used in legal cases. That means, among other things, that reporters must ask non-leading questions and not coach witnesses they speak with on how to answer. The journalists are not affiliated with any court system and receive support from foundations and non-profits. The interviews sometimes feature in news reports, but Di Giovanni says there is a bigger purpose.
In the short term, working with prosecutors, working with advocacy, putting pressure on the UN or governments, in the long term to keep a lasting memorial of what happened.
2 years into Russia's full-scale invasion of Ukraine, the project is laying the groundwork for future war crimes trials. Natalia Gumenyuk leads a Kyiv-based team focused on talking with survivors and witnesses to war crimes.
So everybody to whom we talk potentially are eligible to speak at court. In the cooperation with international analysts and lawyers, we developed this methodology to where what they say is not just the journalistic material, but also can be used as evidence for the prosecutors, for the law enforcement in Ukraine and abroad.
An important task is to prove that certain war crimes are not an aberration, but part of a pattern perpetrated by the Russian army. Moscow denies carrying out atrocities, even as the UN documents Russian tactics causing over 10,000 civilian deaths, its abduction of hundreds, possibly thousands of children, and use of rape as a weapon.
We see that the same commanders are still, shelling the rockets indiscriminately into the civilian infrastructure, into the train station, houses, shopping malls, and things like that. And they act the same way. They torture the people. They electrocute them the very same way in Berdyansk and in Kherson, in Kakhovka, and as it was in Izum.
With the International Criminal Court issuing arrest warrants for Russian President Vladimir Putin and the US unsealing war crimes charges against Russian military personnel, the work of the Reckoning Project and others is likely to play an important role in future hearings. Anna Chernikova, VOA News, Kyiv.
Now we go to Nigeria, where Timothy Obiezo has been speaking with journalists at Humango. The media outlet is filling a gap in conflict reporting by giving those affected by extremist groups a voice.
You have been documenting and reporting on the humanitarian cost of a long-standing conflict in Nigeria, and many times even speaking with Boko Haram survivors. And anyone could wonder, why does this area of journalism interest you?
Thank you very much. Human Angle is the brainchild of Ahmed Saud Kida, who is a frontrunner when it comes to documenting the Boko Haram crisis. He was at the front lines when the crisis began, when it spilled, and even before it became violent. He was one of the earliest people signaling the crisis. And over the years, he realized that there was a huge vacuum in reporting violence generally, conflict, not just in Nigeria, but across the continent. And so in March 2020, he established the platform, Human Angle, to fill that gap.
Tell us about challenges with access to information from authorities.
There are stories you want to tell that people would be very reluctant to talk to you because they fear for their safety, and which is rational. Again, because we live in an environment where clamped down by the authorities are not uncommon.
What role, in your opinion, should the media play in helping understand conflict and giving the people a voice?
What I think is maybe even of utmost importance is the fact that there's a platform that is for the people, the victims of war, the victims of underdevelopment, the victims of humanitarian crisis. A platform that is not just there to break the news and share the statistics, but that is interested in getting the entire gamut of their experiences and sharing that with the world as genuinely as possible. And that's also quite important for us. And then, of course, there's also, drawing attention to a lot of things that are getting underreported. But if there's one thing that we've seen in Nigeria, it is that conflict spreads like wildfire if care is not taken. And so people also need to show interest and be concerned and hold their leaders accountable.
Kunle Adebajo, Investigations Editor at Human Angle, thank you so much.
My pleasure.
Now in Myanmar, where we also see repressive conditions for the media 3 years on from the coup. The junta takeover wiped out a decade of press freedom gains, watchdogs say, forcing many outlets to relocate. We caught up with some of those journalists to hear how they keep news getting in and out of the country.
On the third anniversary of Myanmar's coup, the streets of the country's largest city, Yangon, are quiet, save for a military presence. Citizens are encouraged to stay inside for a silent protest. But in the country's north, a resistance movement is fighting back. The fighting has displaced millions of civilians, including journalists at Democratic Voice of Burma, or DVB. But from newsrooms outside of Myanmar, they keep reporting. Exile is not new for DVB, founded in 1992 in Norway under prior junta rule. The broadcaster moved to Myanmar during civilian rule, only to have to flee again in 2021. But experience hasn't made the job easier.
It's harder, in fact, because we have to rebuild everything, almost like from the scratch. What I call it, we have to flee, we have to regroup, and we have to rebuild.
With access to independent news restricted in Myanmar, DVB and other media now working from exile play a vital role.
I think the media become crucial, countering fake news and also countering propaganda, telling the truth about the situation on the ground.
To get news on the conflict, DVB relies on a large network of citizen journalists on the ground, without whom it says it is nearly impossible to get verified information. In Thai cities like Chiang Mai, some news outlets use exile as a shield. Frontier Myanmar's team takes on stories that are harder to cover inside the country, but nothing is guaranteed.
We have all the security protocols, online, offline, and personal security protocols that we follow. And we've been very careful whatever move that we make. But then, people get arrested for unexpectedly, right?
Mementos and photographs adorn Frontier's walls, a reminder of its work's importance. And awards are also displayed at DVB, small reminders of the lives and loved ones left behind.
We try not to communicate with our family member inside Burma because that can be a trace. So we cut off all the contact with our immediate family member.
Despite the hardships, Frontier's team has a clear focus.
I think our job is to monitor what is going on, especially after 3 years of coup. We want to keep our eyes and ears open and basically report everything.
From exile, these outlets remain a key source of independent news. For VOA News in Thailand, Arash Arabasadi.
Closer to home, our colleague Christina Casada-Smith caught up with Corinne Dufka, a photojournalist who covered wars for more than a decade, from El Salvador to Mogadishu and beyond. Here, Dufka explains in her own words the power of photography and the important role of journalists during conflict.
One feels a lot of power as a photojournalist because your images are seen all over the world and by influential policy makers. So it was, I felt like there was the potential to impact the world in a really meaningful way. And to do it through a combination of what moves the heart because of the emotion that is communicated through photography, as well as intellectually because of what the photo means. I was a photojournalist for about a dozen years in the 80s and 90s, and I specialized in armed conflict and war photography. When one starts looking at the pictures in my book, one doesn't have to get far to see that the majority of them portray the impact of conflict on the civilian population. In El Salvador, as well as the other conflicts, the other 8 conflicts that are covered in my book, I really tried to use people's faces and their expressions to communicate the horror of what they were seeing. One picture that has impacted me is a picture of families as they were observing an exhumation of their family member who had been abducted by the death squads. So this book, first and foremost, was a part of my own personal journey to come to terms with the tumultuous decade plus that I covered. It was also important at that time to recognize the role that we played. Our job, our role, which was a really important one, was to communicate to the outside world what was happening at that time, to raise alarm bells in state capitals, to inform the public and policymakers about a conflict. I went from conflict to Sierra Leone, DRC, Liberia, Sudan, from conflict to conflict to conflict. And I burned out, and that was evident in a sense of dehumanization that I felt. I didn't feel anything really for my victims, for my family, for anyone. That's when I decided to leave. Journalists play an essential, indispensable role in our world. And I think that role is even more important with the advent of fake news and artificial intelligence. Responsible, balanced, neutral journalism has always been important. I didn't look back. I don't regret it for a minute. And yet I hold with tremendous esteem the photojournalists who continue to inform us through visual storytelling.
As we've seen, the Israel-Hamas war is the most dangerous conflict for media in recent history. The UN Secretary General had this to say about the death toll.
I'm troubled by the number of journalists that have been killed in these conflicts. Freedom of press is a fundamental condition for the people to be able to know what's really happening everywhere in the world.
Journalists in Gaza say the high death toll makes every report they do vital. But as more die among their ranks and the war expands, their ability to deliver the news is rapidly decreasing. Here's VOA correspondent Heather Murdoch.
Many journalists inside Gaza now live here in Rafah, near the border with Egypt, where the population has grown more than 5 times since the war began in October. And Gaza residents continue to flee to Rafah as Israeli armed forces move south. Journalists working here say every story could be their last, but then again, so could every trip to the market to find food or fuel, to a hospital to search for missing, injured, or dead loved ones, or even to bed every night.
The situation in Gaza is very difficult, and covering Gaza is very difficult. A person can be killed by reporting any news or images for broadcast.
Depending on who is counting, the number of journalists killed in more than 4 months of war between Israel and Hamas varies. But all accounts show that the death toll for journalists is higher than in any other war in recent history. The Committee to Protect Journalists reports 85 deaths, while the United Nations says 122. Journalists inside Gaza say the number has risen to 130 since the last time anyone published a count. Mortaja says the increasing difficulty of reporting from Gaza has made every bit of information they can publish more crucial to the world's understanding of the war from the point of view of the people in Gaza.
By restricting journalists and reducing their mental strength, they can stop journalists from delivering the news professionally. But when they kill a journalist, it also increases our determination to continuously deliver the story and the truth.
The Israeli government has banned the international press from entering Gaza. And in December, the Foreign Press Association in Jerusalem petitioned the Israeli Supreme Court for access beyond tightly controlled military tours. The court denied the petition, saying it would cause an undue burden on the Israeli Defense Forces. Inside Gaza, reporters say their ability to deliver the news is rapidly diminishing.
It's a war from all directions on journalists and on the whole community. The Israeli occupation frequently cuts communications as part of their assault, reducing our capacity to get information from the restricted locations that we were forced to flee from in the north.
The Israeli government has said repeatedly that it does not target journalists or other civilians, a claim international rights groups and Palestinian journalists dispute. Reporting with Nadal Hamdouna and Amjad Tantesh in Rafah, Gaza, Heather Murdoch, VOA News, Istanbul.
That's all for this week. Thanks for watching The Inside Story. For the latest news, you can log on to voanews.com. Follow us on Instagram and Facebook at VOA News. For all your press freedom related content, you can follow me on X, formerly Twitter, at Jessica Jareen. Catch up on past episodes at our free streaming service, VOA+. We'll see you next week for The Inside Story.
In times of change, when the world seems uncertain, and what we hear doesn't reflect what we see, we seek the truth. When we are told only part of the story, we lose trust. In moments of crisis, our dreams, hopes, and wishes for a better tomorrow depends on a free press. At Voice of America, we bring you the stories that people take risks to see. We connect the world and unite it with truth. At Voice of America, we show you the whole picture.